So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Government Policy Commitments and National Action Plans in South Asia. I'm Adarsh from Q Design, and I will be your technical facilitator today. The chat is disabled for the session, so if you have any questions send to the speakers, send it through the Q&A function. Please note that the session today is recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message me for help using the Q&A function. I will now hand it over to Harpreet.
Thanks, Adarsh. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from whichever part of the world you're joining. Very welcome and glad to have all of you here. The OHCHR's guidance on developing the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights defines a national action plan as an evolving policy strategy developed by a state to protect against adverse human rights impacts by business enterprises in conformity with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The UN Working Group considers 4 essential criteria to be indispensable for a NAP to be effective. First, NAPs need to be founded on the UNGPs. In other words, NAPs need to adequately reflect on states' duties under international human rights law to protect against adverse corporate human rights impacts and provide effective access to remedy as well. Further, a NAP needs to promote business respect for human rights, including through due diligence processes. Moreover, NAPs must be underpinned by the human rights principles of non-discrimination and equality. Second, the NAPs need to be context-specific and address the country's actual and potential adverse corporate human rights impacts. Third, the NAPs need to be developed in inclusive and transparent processes. Interested stakeholders need to be allowed to participate in the development of the NAP, and their views need to be taken into account. Information needs to be shared transparently at all stages of the NAP development processes. Fourth, the NAP processes need to be regularly reviewed and updated. They must respond to the changing context and strive. As of today, we have 24 national action plans on business and human rights worldwide. In Asia, Thailand and Japan have adopted standalone national action plans, while South Korea has included a chapter on business and human rights national action plan. Pakistan has recently drafted its National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights and has put it up for public consultations and inputs. India is also at an advanced stage of NAP development, while other countries in South Asia still have to make formal commitments towards developing a National Action Plan. Today, this session aims to stimulate discussion around different policy tools to promote business and human rights, including standalone National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights, business and human rights chapters in the National Action Plan on Human Rights, and other potentially relevant policy tools. With that, I would like to invite our esteemed panel today to have this discussion and tell us more about what's happening in other countries in South Asia as well. With that, I would like to invite Zoha Shahid, Senior Research Associate, Research on Society of International Law from Pakistan, Dheeraj, Program Manager from Praxis India, Akiko Sato, who's the Japan Program Coordinator of Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Kanishka Veerasinghe, Director General, the Employees Federation of Ceylon, and Gautam Bhattacharya, Minister Counselor, Embassy of Sweden in India. Thank you all for joining us today. The first question is to all of you, to all the panelists, and if you could sort of take about 3 minutes to present your perspective on this. The next decade of action will be crucial to address the challenges faced by society today. June 2020 marks the 10th anniversary of the UNGPs, and the next decade of business and human rights is critical for assessing the real impacts on the right holders. At the same time, these are the last 10 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. How do you think governments can fulfill their commitments to promote the implementation of UNGPs, as well as achieve the SDGs? Do you think the national action plans can influence the next decade of action? If so, what would you say and what would you recommend? And if you could start with Gautam, perhaps. Gautam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'll just give a very brief perspective from the Swedish perspective. Since Sweden was one of the first countries to actually draw up a national action plan, we were the 6th, I think, country. And we've been working quite intensively with the issue in Asia. through our development corporation based in Bangkok. I think that, thank you, Harpreet, for your comments. There's a realization that there's only 10 years left for us to fulfill the SDGs. The Swedish government has actually accelerated now, just recently declared that it will accelerate its efforts to try to reach those goals and to try to help other partners reach those goals. And I would like to highlight perhaps that this instance, basically the decent work approach and the fact that Sweden has been very involved in the Global Compact. That's where the Swedish government recently announced that it will accelerate its efforts and devote more efforts into that, including then trying to build more peer pressure, so to speak, to get more governments on board of that. So I think the Swedish government has been committed to this process from the very beginning, but we see the need to accelerate, and the government has really done that with an emphasis on decent work and Global Compact. So I'll come back to more issues later on, but that's my perspective on it. Thank you. Harpreet, hello?
Perhaps we can ask Akiko to go ahead and share her.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, let's just continue in the meantime. We might have lost Harpreet. Please.
Okay, yeah, thank you for having me here to with the distinguished panelists. So yeah, I would like to share some of the viewpoints from the Japanese perspective, which they launched the National Action Plan last October. So I think the NAP itself, they accelerate the discussion on the relevant policies, including SDGs. So they're based on the experience of being involved in the drafting NAP. For the NAP, the way stakeholders, I mean, from the corporates and the civil society that could join together and discuss how the UNGP can be incorporated into the relevant policies and with the relevant ministries. But I think I found the difficulties as well at the same time, because the ministries sometimes they find the UNGP is not relevant to them. Because the UNGP, they said the business is human rights, and human rights they sometimes are regarded as the matter for specific ministry. So I think that this is also the challenges, how to convince all of the stakeholders that this is the issue for them. And so I think the NAP can be used for for all the stakeholders to be used as the common tool or the common languages. So the Japan there has just started the implementation phase, so that we should make it sure the UNGP or NAP they're mentioned in all of the policies, and they keep the policy coherence. So this is my belief intervention. Thanks. Okay.
Sorry, we've had some internet issue at my end, and I'm not very sure what I missed. So if somebody could update me on that, that would be great.
Gautam and Akiko spoke on the issues that you asked us. I think it's a case of continuing from there, Harpreet.
Great, thanks. And if we can move on to Zoha, please.
Thank you so much, Harpreet, for having me here, and thank you for all the panelists for your comments. I think when we talk about the United Nations guiding principles and how they correspond to the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to sort of emphasize on the fact that the UNGPs do not really create a new set of obligations for any state. And we have to focus on how these are existing obligations that have been molded to business activity, and they still need to be enforced within business activity. So personally, I think, and from a Pakistani perspective as well, what needs to be done within government policies and within national action plans is to find where the UNGPs engage with the SDGs. It is extremely important to identify what actions that you're taking within your NAPs are corresponding to the SDGs that you're trying to achieve as well. So within Pakistan's national baseline assessment, at least, we did correspond every area that we were looking to the SDGs as well. So we've seen that SDGs require us to create targeted interventions for gender equality, for decent work, for clean water and sanitation, for economic growth. All of these are things that are being enforced through the UNGPs as well. So right now, the focus should be, and this is a golden opportunity where you have a decade has passed to the UNGPs, a decade is left to achievement of the SDGs. This is the right time for governments to focus on how this engagement and how this link can be drawn between the two documents, and how we can use the two to achieve common goals and to sort of create this uniformity and coherence within our policies as well. And I think that is an important, and that is the first step to creating government policy as well. To make it efficient, to make it adequate, we need to identify how we can achieve two goals through the same thing. And that is something that the UNGPs and the SDGs together can do. And that is something that needs to be emphasized and highlighted in government policies as well. Thank you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Soha. And if we can move on to Kanishka now. Kanishka, the floor is yours.
Harpreet, thank you very much for this opportunity. Getting on to the national action plans, I think from a perspective of employer, business member organizations in the region, we are all committed to the principles of business linking human rights with business, and particularly in relation to the world of work. We have done a lot of work and also supported government plans in relation to SDGs. Unfortunately, some of our countries in the region, including mine, have not formalized NAPs, but we have had draft documents setting out in Sri Lanka for draft NAP for 2016 and up to 2021. I think what needs to be done is to implement them and have a vision and certain goals, so that we achieve. And I quite agree with Zoha that these UNGPs and the SDGs are very much interlinked, and government should also seek the support of EBMOs. We are operating at national and different levels, and we can add a lot in relation to what we do, because groundwork has already been done, and we are also doing a lot of work in relation to getting this message across to the regions. So I think the governments also have to reach out to us and create opportunities, so that we can participate effectively and support these national efforts. After all, the objective is to enhance human rights conditions in each of our countries, and that's the objective. It's not only for getting advantage in relation to trade and things like that, but it's a self enhancement for every citizen in the region and in our country. So I think NAPs are an useful means of getting there. In addition to that, we may even need to set up common organizations to promote SDGs and UNGP, especially set up institutions to create awareness for businesses. And government should also get support for, and also we will try on our own as well to support us in relation to getting this message across. So those are my initial thoughts. Thank you, Harpreet. I think you're muted, Harpreet.
Thanks. And if we can move on to Dheeraj as well. Dheeraj, your floor.
Yeah, thanks, Harpreet. So I think in Indian case, when it comes to aligning of UNGPs and SDGs, there has been a localized framework, I will say, in terms of national guidelines on responsible business conduct, which have been updated from its previous version, which was unveiled in 2011. And there are very clearly stated 9 principles, and which are very much aligned with SDG goals, or if you look at some of the key principles or pillars that UNGP is defining. So there is a clear framework that has come up in last decade or so, starting 2011. And based on that, there have been very clear kind of instructions in terms of having a mandatory reporting from now almost, it has been expanded to top 1,000 companies in India. So when it comes to, in terms of opportunity, what I see that NAPs, UNGPs and SDGs coming together provide us with an opportunity to build certain narratives or to engage with certain processes to build culture of business and human rights, I would say. And with increasing role of businesses here, it is important that this culture also kinds of goes deep to levels of community and civil society organizations and smaller businesses. So that is where I think there will be a critical challenge to NAP as a process, whether it is able to reach out to these constituencies over the period. And that is where the next decade of business and human rights are going to be critical for Indian space, because there's a clear understanding, and that is what came out from yesterday's country focused session also, that we cannot only focus on top businesses in India if we want to bring this culture, we want to mainstream this culture, but at the same time, it is not that burden of incorporating this principle should fall on smaller businesses at the same time. So that there's one way, there are dual ways. At one level, big businesses need to set example for others to start following, and on the other end, we need to bring communities and civil society groups to start monitoring this NAP process. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Dheeraj, and thanks everyone. I think Zoha used a term, golden opportunity. It really is a golden opportunity to bring the two different agendas together, but heartening to see how India and both Pakistan, who have a draft national action plan in place, at least have sort of brought together the different agendas as well. Also, just picking up from what Kanishka said, and Dheeraj, you in the end talked about sort of the importance of not just having not just making businesses responsible, which are large sizes, but then also taking it to the smaller sizes. And I think my takeaway from the first, round of discussion is really about, we have to make sure that respecting human rights becomes a norm for the businesses, and it's not just one-off thing to do. So kind of how do we bring that culture, and how do we ensure that businesses respect human rights, and that's been set up as more of a norm and a culture. Thank you, everyone. With that, we're going to move on to the next section. And Zoha, I'm going to come to you. The Minister of Human Rights, Shireen Mazari, launched the National Action Plan draft last week. We are aware that you've been engaged with the NAP development process in Pakistan. Would you take us through the process, the challenges that you face and how these challenges were overcame, and how did you address these challenges? And any specific recommendations that you would have for other countries who are particularly in South Asia, and bringing in a more regional perspective on what you think would be really useful for other South Asian countries to keep in mind who are in the process of developing the National Action Plan. The floor is yours, Zoha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harpreet. This is a very interesting question, because the NAP development process has been in itself a very exciting journey, and it has given us an opportunity to engage and to learn with experts from the field as well. So the initial aim for this whole process was to prioritize human rights and business activity, and to signal to the business community that they need to act responsibly and ethically while conducting their activities. If I were to divide the NAP development process, it was divided into 4 stages. We started off with the research phase. The idea was that any policy document that is going to ultimately be implemented and will be a practical document needs to be an informed one. So the process started with us conducting a very extensive baseline assessment on Pakistan's existing human rights standards and the extent to which laws exist to regulate business activity in Pakistan. For the national baseline assessment, we used the Danish Institute of Human Rights template, which is used by countries to identify the existing level of implementation of the UNGPs and other relevant business and human rights frameworks by state and the business sector. Within the baseline assessment, we took a cross-sectoral approach, because we understand that business and human rights are not a standalone topic. They're not a theme that can be distinguished from other themes, and they need to be looked at through the lens of wide-ranging issues, including due diligence, environment and land, consumer protection, labor rights, anti-bribery and corruption, the role of national human rights institutions, human rights defenders. So our first step was to contextualize the DHIR framework or template to Pakistan, to identify what areas we need to work on in Pakistan and to carry out an assessment of our legislative framework. We then engaged with public sector companies to draw a state business nexus. And then we engaged with private sector companies to identify what sort of human rights components existed within their current business policies as well. The baseline assessment allowed us to create targeted recommendations, and we identified key areas of intervention which served as a roadmap. But this is basically something that was part of the research phase and sort of flew into the consultation phase, because without consultations, without really understanding what is going to be the practical impact of a document that we're creating, no actual change can take place. So from the research phase, we moved on to the consultation phase, which was led by the Ministry of Human Rights, and we conducted multi-stakeholder consultations to identify whether the key areas of intervention that we had identified were actually the ones that needed help on ground reality as well. And the consultations were held in major cities to learn from the experiences of the business community and the government stakeholders there, and to get provincial input as well, because the Ministry of Human Rights has envisioned that this is not a document that is going to be a standalone document. It is a document that, while has state ownership, is a public document, which is why engagement and multi-stakeholder consultations were really focused on. However, I know that the first draft of the NAP has been published and it is open for comments, but this journey was far from smooth. So we cannot really claim that this was a journey without its challenges. We faced countless challenges, the first one of which was to conduct this very large study on what existed in Pakistan and what didn't exist in Pakistan. And for developing countries, I assume that this is generally a South Asian problem as well. There's lack of data, which is why we had to go into the communities and to understand what ground realities were, because it is easy to do a desk review, but it is harder to see how actual reality really pans out. So the first step was to identify what our landscape was, what we're working with. Secondly, the biggest challenge was probably to bring businesses on board and to sort of persuade them that this is something that is good for them as well. This is something that, of course, businesses naturally look at their economic interests, and their economic interests are prioritized. So we focused on using that trickle-down approach that was talked about as well. We sort of talked to larger corporations first so that they could ultimately influence smaller corporations. And we sort of explained to them that human rights and compliance with human rights standards is something that is beneficial for everybody. And we've seen that, and we've evidenced in the requirements of the GSP plus status that Pakistan enjoys as well. And then finally, I think my largest challenge, according to me, was to ensure that the momentum is not lost. A lot of public policies are usually lost in the pipeline because they are rushed, and then the momentum is really lost. And that is something that I would advise to every other country that is in the process of developing a national action plan, or even implementing a national action plan as well. A national action plan on business and human rights has to be a living document. It has to be something that needs continuous focus and continuous work. So I think that for the human rights and business agenda to actually be realized, it is extremely important that we make practical documents, practical recommendations that can actually be applied, and we don't lose the momentum around this thing. Thank you so much, Harpreet.
Thanks, Soha. You raised this really important point about that the momentum should not be lost. And, and Dheeraj, I'm going to come to you because, we know that the government of India launched the Zero Draft of National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights in March 2019, just before the inaugural of the South Asia Forum, in fact. And, it has now been 2 years. There's the world has in some ways, changed, and we've had those kind of unprecedented challenges. And where do you see, where do you see India moving on the National Action Plan development process? And we've of course, we've been listening that it is at an advanced stages. If you could also just highlight a little more on what's happening on the National Action Plan in India, and how do we make it a more meaningful, participatory, and inclusive process while developing the National Action Plan, as Zoha just mentioned. Thank you. The floor is yours, Dheeraj.
Thanks, Harpreet. So I think in India, it was in 2018 that Ministry of Corporate Affairs came out with zero draft, and that is where I think the initiation in terms of, we can say in terms of National Action Plan started from that phase. But if you look at the process further to that, and in 2020, again, Ministry came out with a clear note stating that they are seeking public consultation, and they seek to organize consultations with various stakeholder groups. And another institution which has taken active interest is NHRC, I would say National Human Rights Commission in India, which now has a working group on business and human rights, and is organizing regular consultations and reaching out to ministry with their inputs in India. Talking about civil society participation, there have been various consultations. Some of them have been organized by UNDP. Then UN Women had their own set of consultations. Then Center for Responsible Business and Institute for Human Development, along with Ministry, had a round of consultation with trade unions and civil society groups. We, as Corporate Responsibility Watch, Partners in Change and Praxis, had series of consultations across India, reaching out to more than 600 civil society organizations and individuals. So there have been series of processes in between, but still I will say a big challenge is in terms of how much of it is linking to the grassroots or to communities who are getting affected with these processes. So many, that remains a huge challenge in this process. And zero draft to some extent gave a direction, I would say, in terms of certain broad headings related to labor as a constituency, or to entire issue around business and state nexus, or issue around public procurement. So these are some of the major headings that have come across from the zero draft process. And later on, these submissions have been made. So this challenge stand as of now today. So now present status is what we unofficially know, that ministry is finalizing the draft. We don't know whether it is going to be first draft or the final draft in public, but our suggestion is that it should go for one more round of public consultation when it comes out in public domain, and there should be incorporation of a diverse set of views on this plan. Because what is also happening over the period, many of the groups are also losing their confidence, because on one hand we are talking about National Action Plan as a progressive trajectory, and on the other hand all the laws, be it the labor laws or laws related to farmers or related to environmental protection, are getting diluted. So though on one hand we are talking about this framework in terms of 3 pillars of UNGPs, but on the other hand there are real legislative challenges, I would say, that are being thrown to public at large. So there needs to be some more consultation, surely. Present status is that probably maybe in March or April or May, we would have the final draft ready, and this will be in public. But not to deny that these challenges are very much real.
Thanks, Dheeraj. So what I'm listening from you, both Dheeraj and Zoha, is, Zoha, you highlighted about the importance of the research and the baseline assessment just to understand the scale and scope of the issues, but then also ensuring that we contextualize it to the country realities. Picking on that, Dheeraj, you also mentioned, how does the NAP link to the ground realities, and how is it going to respond to the ground realities of a country in conversation in there? But then also, Zoha, you mentioned that it has to be a practical, it has to be a document that's easy to implement and has to be a living document. And among us, we have Akiko, who's been also, who've been sort of following the Japan NAP very, very closely. And Akiko, if I could bring you in here to just sort of talk about, you've looked at the Japan NAP, it's a standalone National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights released just last year. What do you think are the strengths and weaknesses of the Japan's National Action Plan? If there's any recommendation that you would, that you think would be good to follow for the National Action Plans that's either in the development process or even the baseline has to be started. Thanks.
Thank you, Harpreet. So as I mentioned in the intervention, we launched an app last October, and I have to say that one of the strengths is to have the NAP itself. So before having NAP, the UNGP was not so well known to particularly the business community. But after launching the NAP, the more and more the companies are interested in NAP, and also their investors are taking the NAP very seriously. So I think having the NAP, they can be the one of the biggest the strengths. And also regarding the content, I would say the content are still a bit weak, but at least there are the ministries which are in charge of its policies. So this can be also be useful to have the dialogue with the relevant ministries. And also the third point is that the NAP explicitly mentions that the government expects the companies to conduct the human rights due diligence, and which they can be a change maker, I feel. Because there's same as the UNGP, of course, the human rights due diligence itself is a very new word for the companies, and we do not have any legislation in relation to the human rights due diligence. But since we have NAP, and they're asking the companies to conduct human rights due diligence, and now the companies are really thinking of how to do that. So I think that these are the strengths I can see out of our NAP, but also that there are so many weaknesses as well. So the first is that I really want to echo what Zoha mentioned, that which should be the NAP should be the practical the tool, but actually our NAP doesn't have any concrete actions to be implemented, and it's more like a list of existing policies which are disappointed, which are the biggest the disappointment among stakeholders. And also through the drafting process, we stakeholders submitted the common interest letter twice to the government, because we came together and found that although we are coming from the different background, but there are so many things that we need to ask their government to include the NAP, NAP. So, but these kind of things were not so well reflected in the NAP. So this should be also amended maybe for the next NAP. And also I would like to stress that the policy coherence is also still weak. So as they already discussed, the interlinkage between SDGs and also other the common languages like ESG or a green recovery, that should be should be emphasized. But the aspect is quite vague in our NAP. And also their monitoring, their phase, their NAP is the living document. So even after the first day of the NAP, that we should think how it is implemented and how it can be monitored and how it will be reviewed. But still there even we have already the 6 months after the launching NAP, there can be no the next step. So I think this should be more concrete to make the NAP more active. So I like to suggest to my colleagues who are now developing NAPs is that the process itself is quite useful, so that we can take advantage of their drafting process to disseminate the common language and ideas among stakeholders, and such kind of the relationship will be very useful even after having the NAP itself. And also that we should ask the governments to have the practical and also the very effective their actions into NAP with relevant KPIs, the indicators as well. So that is my comment there for our NAP.
Thanks, Akiko. And I see there's a question already for you there in the Q&A box. And this is also a reminder to all the participants, if you have any questions, please enter the questions into the Q&A function, and we will take the questions in the due time. Akiko, you did highlight, you've highlighted like a really important point, how even just the NAP development process is it's such a great opportunity to create awareness about business and human rights, but then also bringing together different stakeholders together to push the business and human rights agenda in a country. You did talk about also the concrete action matrix with that has the targets as well as the timeline, so that you're also able to monitor the progress on the National Action Plan. Kanishka, let me come to you. This is sort of the third day of the forum. We've had the pre-forum sessions and the sessions yesterday, and a lot of discussions about the National Action Plans have been in the context of the impact of COVID-19 on businesses and the economy in general. I mean, it has hit hard everybody, but in certain ways, the way that it had impacted businesses has left impacts that are more far and wide and yet to be seen. The CSOs have also raised concerns that the governments may turn around on their NAP commitments, citing the need to ease of doing business. And yesterday in a session, I think it was Professor Suryadeva who was saying, how do we kind of bring in the ease of doing responsible business? So, these policies obviously will have a huge impact, particularly because they're going to set expectation from the businesses. How do you think NAPs will be useful for the businesses? And I think if you could also sort of provide your comments and perspective on, having a concrete action plan. Do you think that's going to help businesses in delivering to the commitments of the National Action Plan or the expectations from the businesses? The floor is yours, Kanishka.
Thank you very much for that question, and no doubt about it. I think Dheeraj and Zoha mentioned about the importance of, and also Akiko mentioned about being consistent with the NAPs, and in the case of Sri Lanka, I think we should adopt the draft very quickly and maybe even look beyond 2021, which the draft currently addresses, because that will be a important aspect, because there shouldn't be gaps in relation to the partners, because yes, the government is the lead, should take the lead, but it also should give guidance in relation to how businesses, because we are already doing certain things on ground. In relation to the SDGs, as everybody has mentioned, it's important that we bring these two aspects together and work in relation to common objects. That's at national policy level. And yes, the COVID has dealt a severe impact on the economy. Sri Lanka reported yesterday that our economy contracted by 3.6%, which is severe. And actually at the initial stages of the COVID, we were looking at unemployment rates at beyond 23% or even more than that. So actually, we looked at, we employers supported the government in relation to the world of work issues. We supported the government to ensure that, that situation does not occur. And we were able to keep unemployment down to around 8% in real terms and around 6.7% in official terms. Because of the policies that we adopted at that time, because we brought in an agreement at the national level to prorate wages, and that allowed employers, yes, to take a breather, but at the same time allowed employees to as many employees to keep their livelihoods, and that was a focus. And Zoha mentioned about building momentum and taking decisions based on tangibles, and the government had a census, and also we had a survey done. And the businesses returned sentiments saying that their main intention is to protect the workforce. So that was a huge plus point for us to work on, in spite of the difficulties they were facing, and many of them had zero income levels. But in spite of that, their commitment was well elicited in relation to protecting workforce. Then they also talked about giving priority to new forms of employment, work from home policies, which encouraged new jobs to be created, retain jobs, and also to support low-income earners. So that was a major commitment on the part of employers, and they also talked about the importance of investing on digitalization and so on to create new types of jobs, because we are not going to look at a new normal. It's going to be a totally different scenario where the world of work is concerned, and it will be the same. So yes, there might be issues with regard to a negative aspect, negative impact in the short term, but I don't think we can be complacent in allowing any human rights standards to deteriorate. In fact, we should be looking at enhancing, because otherwise we'll be creating another problem, socio-economic problem for ourselves, and business needs to lead. And talking about ease of business, governance and accountability is a huge issue. So, and it's important for us to promote governance and accountability at the national level, and because that will help in our ease of doing business index. So there are huge advantages for business to support national initiatives and to have a clear NAP as well as policies, have a vision and maybe objectives is going to be helpful to business. And again, I come back to the issue of enhancing capacities of EBMOs. Even at national levels, we see that there is deficiencies in capacity to understand the link between business and human rights. India and Pakistan have set a great example. We can learn from them. And now things like starting off with the matrix to make a self-assessment, those things are very important, Harpreet. So I think we need to start, cite good examples from India and Pakistan as to how they have gone about doing it. And I think we could spread the word amongst businesses. EBMOs have a huge opportunity there. We consider it as an opportunity and a good one to enhance not only the rights of our own citizens, but the rights of enhancing maybe collectively taking that message in relation to the entire region. And lastly, I would like to say that this has to be consistent, and it has to be, it should be in the language that business understands. Of course, there has to be education and, you know, at all levels, because human rights should be the same for everyone, because you can't have any differentiated levels. It should apply to all strata, irrespective of where you operate. And this is where there are challenges, as Dheeraj mentioned. Yes, there are challenges in the mainstream, in the formal sector as well, but we have huge informal sectors in our countries, and we need to ensure that, you know, this message and these values permeate down. And I spoke day before as well in one of the sessions, and this is something that we need to focus. We need to not only enhance the capacity of EBMOs, but in turn educate our members as well as those in the SME sector, where there are huge commitments that they make in relation to the supply chain, and that's very important. I think governments as well as EBMOs should reach out to the United Nations, and EBMOs can reach out to the ILO as well to enhance capacity, even to set up specialized units within themselves or specialized agency that would coordinate. Ideally, there should be a national effort, national institution, and then that should actually invite business as well as other stakeholders to nominate participants, so that we are consistent in our approach at the national, regional, and even down to trickle down to the enterprise level, even down to the SMEs level. So that's the consistency that we should look at. I don't think we can be complacent. I don't think business can afford to expect to lower standards. I think we should continue our efforts to comply with higher standards, even if it means complying with, even if the municipal laws are not providing for those standards. I think we should go out on our own, as we have done before, and set those standards. In relation to the world of work, there are so many examples. I think knowing and showing is a good way to go. And I think India and Pakistan has set the pace for business and how we should approach this subject. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Kanishka. You've kind of also sort of talking about that awareness raising is just raising awareness is not enough, but you also need to build capacity of not just the large businesses, but then also the MSMEs. Kanishka, if I could ask for a clarification, so you're saying, is there a draft national action plan in Sri Lanka, or at least there's one in progress? Or, I mean, even if there's not a national action plan, are there any policy commitments from the government on responsible business?
Well,
You could clarify that.
There is a draft, and we've also called for consultations about a year and a half ago. But I think what needs to be done is to be consistent in our approach, because some of these matters have already been implemented as well. And we supported the implementation, for example, incorporation of a new chapter on fundamental rights in the Constitution, the new constitutional amendments which promoted the independent commissions. Then also the implementation of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights Act of 56 of 2007, and also the Right to Information Act. That was a crucial piece of legislation that we supported to improve governance and accountability at the highest levels. So these are some of the things that we expect to be implemented consistently, and we will certainly support the government. And I hope that ecosystems will be created so that businesses, the voice of business also can be heard. And we can certainly support, because I think it should be a collective voice. There shouldn't be any gaps. And we are willing to support the government of Sri Lanka to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Gautam, I'm going to move on to you. One of the advocacy lessons that they give is to use all the tools that you have in an advocacy box, and including the peer pressure by other states. What would you just say is the role of the foreign governments, embassies, and international organizations in securing commitments from the governments and ensure the development and the implementation of National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights? The floor is yours, Gaurav.
Thank you. Thank you. It's fascinating to listen to all the colleagues here and how far they've come in their processes and the obstacles. Sweden has had its policy in place for, as you know, 5-6 years now, but still work in progress. And it's the same in the discussion with our companies. Many of them are global and active on very different markets in very different contexts. So let me begin there instead. I think that the one practical learning is that perhaps we should strengthen the involvement of MNCs in the National Action Plan process in your respective countries. Swedish companies, for example, in India, where I am active, we have over 220 companies here, some of them very large like IKEA and H&M with sourcing chains, and they're working very actively on developing MSMEs, as far as they can go in the supply chain. So I think I see a real potential if you want a practical comment, that we haven't really been able to crack that, to how to involve the MNCs in a country and join them into the process. Because I think there are a lot of learnings, a lot of best practices that the local conglomerates and smaller companies could possibly pick up. So there I see really a need, and where the embassies and chambers of commerce can be a catalyst. So that's really more of a practical observation. When it comes to what countries are doing, well, Sweden, I think charity begins at home. And if you look at the Swedish National Action Plan, it clearly defines that it's an expectation of the Swedish government on the companies that they must act in accordance with the UNGP and all the international conventions and stipulations that are there. So I mean, the government has made it clear from the outset that we expect our companies to do this, but not only that we expect them, but it's in their own best interest. I think, as Zoha and others were saying, that the companies at the end of the day must see it as an investment in themselves, in their long-term sustainability. Swedish companies generally have come quite far in that aspect. I don't think we have to convince them much, but taking it from policy to action is always a challenge. So the government, for example, in our National Action Plan, that's another perhaps recommendation or idea, that we put up annexes, what has been done and what we are planning to do, practical measures, from policy measures to actually practical issues such as instructing our government agencies, development cooperation, our state-owned enterprises that they must take these principles into consideration in their operations. So, I mean, quite hands-on recommendations from the government to itself and to the wider community. So I think there's lots to be learned between governments, and I would like to see more of, exchange of experience between countries. I know that, for example, in Asia, I think that Thailand and Pakistan have been consulting quite a lot on the National Action Plan. Japan has inspired Vietnam. So that kind of peer-to-peer transfer of knowledge and would be very valuable. And I think there Sweden has a little more to do. We could become more active in giving our views. So, but I think that that's one thing. Then Sweden has also worked a lot with within the European Union. It's in our national action plan from the beginning that we are going to work actively on getting other countries in the European on board. Most of them have come on board in the years that have passed. So that's one thing that governments definitely can do more actively. Sweden has done it, and I think more governments could commit themselves to spreading the word to other countries. In this region, for example, we will get back to that perhaps in the second round, Harpreet. But through our development cooperation and the regional cooperation in Bangkok to UNDP, we also managed to inspire. I think Thailand was the first country in Asia to join after a recommendation by Sweden in the UPR in the United Nations. So and then subsequently the EU has joined. So we see clearly that you lead by example, and you try to push it, and you put your money where your mouth is. Apart from development cooperation and support to the UN system, we've also supported CSOs like the Center Business and Human Rights Resource Center and the Institute of Human Rights and Business, for example, SHIFT, OECD, Global Compact. So we also support with government money to various civil society actors. So I think that we have a holistic approach. I agree that it's really hard to keep up the momentum sometimes and to get some kind of regularity in the whole process. I think we're also so struggling at that. But these are basically the things that governments can do. And I hope that in Asia, now that Japan and Thailand and soon Pakistan and India are on board, I think there's a lot you can do to inspire other countries. Bangladesh and other countries should be able to come on board as well. And there, I think the governments like Sweden, Japan, and others would be happy to share their experiences. So those are my observations. But on the practical side, I think that working more with the MNCs in the countries is really something we should work more on. Thank you.
Thanks, Gautam. And I think these countries have managed to inspire other countries as well. Today at the Bangladesh country session, we had baseline being conducted and presented on national on business and human rights in Bangladesh, and there's a session tomorrow on Nepal where they will also be presenting a baseline assessment or at least a preliminary assessment on the status of business and human rights in the country. So we do see how these developments on national action plans have inspired the countries where there's still yet to have a formal commitment from the government. Thanks, Gautam. Moving on to the next section, we do have a couple of questions coming up here. And before I go to the next, sorry, what just happened? Maybe if you could take a few questions from the floor here. Akiko, there's a question for you specifically. What factors motivated the administration to commit to developing the national action plan? The floor is yours. And if you could keep it brief, we still have a couple of other questions to go. Thanks, Akiko.
Thank you, Harper, and also thank you for the giving the question. So yeah, this is a very good question. And actually, the commitment from the government was done in 2018 during the Business and Human Rights Annual Forum in Geneva. But since then, there was no any progress. So then actually the CSOs were coming to the government and push the government to initiate their process. And also, of course, there are some pressure from our neighboring countries or like the trading countries like the G7 G7s and also like the EU. So I think I should say that the motivation was actually coming from the outside, but this is there also can be the driver for the government to to make it happen.
Thanks, Akiko. There's also a very interesting question. In fact, Soha, I think there are two questions for for you. This is a question from Livio Sarindria, and he's asking, to his knowledge, the Pakistan National Action Plan is the first to make a reference to the COVID-19 health crisis. Can you elaborate more on how much the pandemic influenced the public discussion that informed the development of the National Action Plan so far, and whether there will be additional actions during the consultation period to beef up the existing chapter on this subject in the current draft? Will dedicated pandemic-related action points be also added? If I could also add to that, Zoha, the question that I wanted to ask you next is, how do you think the governments can ensure that all stages of NAP development process enable meaningful engagement and participation of a broad range of stakeholders? And, looking at this question and knowing, how your consultations must have been influenced by the recency of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you could throw a little bit of light on that, that'd be great.
Right. Thank you, Harpreet. I'm going to start by answering the question. So considering I'm not a government representative, I won't be able to say whether a dedicated chapter would be added to the NAP, but I hope so that it does. To my knowledge, the COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, has had wide-ranging implications. And during the development of the NAP as well, I know that the ministry was ready to share the NAP before, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the limitations that it caused because of consultations and canceling of these consultations, that did affect the development of the NAP process. And I believe, yes, that the COVID-19 health crisis has been mentioned within the National Action Plan. And I think that is one of the advantages of having a national action plan, or at least introducing a national action plan at this time. I personally believe that the pandemic should be used as an opportunity. There has been a lot of talk as to how we can rebuild better post the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this needs to be now reflected within the national action plans and within policy documents that come after the pandemic. And that is something that the Pakistan NAP can learn from as well. We have a dedicated chapter on the COVID-19 health crisis, but we can obviously build upon it. We need to add how this has been a socio-economic crisis, how it has affected businesses, and how that in turn affects the implementation of human rights standards within business activity. Because we've seen that the pandemic did not only have economic implications, it has adversely impacted social rights as well. So what I think personally, and I hope that the Ministry of Human Rights in Pakistan and other relevant ministries who are leading this process of developing the National Action Plan, they definitely should inculcate certain recommendations and certain standards to ensure that public health crises in the future are better dealt with, and they are better dealt with within economic activity as well. And they better guide businesses as to how they can manage their resources when such pandemics happen, even in the future. So I think that is something that I will definitely sort of recommend to the ministry to do, and to recommend to other countries to do as well when they're creating their national action plans, because the world has gone through this situation, this novel situation that no one could have predicted before. So now that we have this opportunity, now that we have learned from this crisis, we should make sure that health is something that is a part of all our public policy documents, because we've seen the wide-ranging impacts that it ultimately has. Moving on to Harpreet's second question, as to how the governments can engage with stakeholders during the creation of an app and even after publishing it. I think what governments really need to understand is that developing a document, conducting research on it, and publishing it is the first step to a national action plan. The actual work starts when you publish the document and you engage with relevant stakeholders, because at the end of the day, the document is state-owned, but it has to be something that will be publicly applied, that will be applied to companies, that will be applied to their activities. So they need to be looked at and they need to be engaged with to understand whether this is practical or not. And I've been emphasizing on the practicality of this policy document, because at least in Pakistan, we've seen that policies do come up, they're rushed, they're lost usually in the pipeline, because we're trying to implement international best practices and we don't contextualize them to what is important in our country. So what, at least with the NAP that we've seen, is that with all these consultations, we have been able to see what the ground reality is, and we've been able to sort of look at it and sort of manage that within the National Action Plan as well, in giving action points and in giving expectations that the state has from businesses. So my advice to countries would be, when you're engaging with your relevant stakeholders, have focus group sessions, include MNCs and SMEs, and try to get an external perspective. And very importantly, do not be afraid of criticism. I think when a policy document is being created by the state, there is this ego that is in place wherein they believe that what they've created is a standard setting document and that should be followed. However, while we're in the stages of developing a standard setting document, it is extremely crucial that you are open to criticism, that you use it to create a document that is practical, that you use it to create a document that will be complied with, that will be enforced, and it is not just a reassertion of international best practices, and it is providing actual solutions to ground realities. Finally, I think it needs to be updated. The NAP should always be a living document. It should always be something that is continuously being monitored. Implementation is focused on, because again, speaking from a developing country perspective, we do end up creating policies, we do create legislative interventions, but we ultimately do not ensure enforcement of that. And implementation has been one of our biggest problems as well. Even during the research phase, we identified a plethora of laws that exist to regulate business activity in Pakistan. But the biggest problem that we face is a lack of implementation and an absence of regulatory requirements. So what is really important for Pakistan and for other countries who are in the process of developing national action plans as well is to create concrete monitoring and evaluation systems, to create concrete systems wherein the NAP can be updated so that the momentum around business and human rights is not lost, which is something that I'm constantly emphasizing on, because we have seen that in developing countries, especially, it is very easy to do that with changing government priorities, with changing governments, with changing circumstances. Our priorities very easily change, which is why we do something, we create a policy, we create standard setting documents, and we very easily abandon them as well, which is why that is something that I would suggest that every country should do, even if they're in the process or at least initiating the process of creating an app. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Soha. Dheeraj, I'm going to move on to you. We were at the country session yesterday on India, and there were lots of discussions about the upcoming draft of the National Action Plan, or at least, moving on from the zero to the first draft of National Action Plan. We just heard from Zoha in terms of, what's happening in Pakistan and some of the best practices. If you were given an option of having a wish list, when the government develops when the government has the draft National Action Plan made available, what would be your wish list? What do you think? What do you think the civil societies would want to happen? What would be the processes? What would be the steps? Any expectations that you think the civil society organizations and generally, also businesses and other stakeholders would have from the government when the draft of the NAP is made available in India?
Thanks, Harpreet. Sorry, I think, in terms of, I wish I had a chance to portray this wish list to the government, but that's not always possible.
Dheeraj, if you could speak a little bit louder.
Yeah, so I was
Thanks.
saying, I hope I had a chance to present this wish list to the government, but in terms of, to be very practical in how we look at this from our engagement so far, one is we need to look at mandatory human rights due diligence as a first step, I would say, and not as an end in itself, because a lot of discussion is happening on that particular process. And there needs to be a culture in terms of looking at stringent changes in the way quasi-judicial and judicial mechanisms are working in terms of providing remedies. At the same time, in interface between government and businesses, we need to have a very structured kind of clarity, I will say, in terms of our incorporation of human rights principles. So that is one recommendation for sure. Second, I think in line with our country session yesterday, we can have 5 to 6 working groups post the draft is in public, and we can clearly look at diversity as an important question, considering a lot of supply chain in India is comprising labor force coming from Dalit, Adivasi, and other marginalized communities. So diversity is one clear point on which discussion should happen. Disclosure and benchmarking, again, which is related to transparency and larger accountability. That could be the second aspect. Then we can look at supply chain and businesses as third category, where we should look at how, what are the kind of recommendations or key practical recommendations that are coming from this constituency. Labor is another constituency that I feel we should focus on, because this pandemic has exposed in a way lot of fault lines, I would say, the way labor is being engaged in business sector, and there's an opportunity to do some key shifts, I will say, in terms of policy. Fourth is human rights defenders and whole domain of remedies, where we need to look at the draft plan, at how it is incorporating those changes. Adding 2 more recommendations. One, considering that India has a federal system of governance, it is important we start looking at state action plans, because national action plan in itself may not lead to changes at a decentralized level of governance. So we need to start engaging with state governments, and already some efforts have started, like from our side, particularly with Tamil Nadu Alliance. We are looking to engage with government in Tamil Nadu and again with other two states in Rajasthan and Odisha to draft state action plans. And last, I will say there should be a very clear financial memorandum along with the National Action Plan, because many times when we talk about processes, there are concerns about cost of compliance in other systems. But here again, at national level, again, if we are talking about a plan, then what is going to be the cost and from where that budget is going to come? So there needs to be a clear financial memorandum with this plan if we want to see it practically implemented. Yeah.
Thanks, Dheeraj. I see there are lots of questions actually for both Kiko and Zoha, having Pakistan and having the draft national action plan of Pakistan, but then also Japanese NAP. If Kiko, I could move on to, quickly 2 questions, and if you could keep your answers very brief, I think that would be useful. I'm just going to sort of go through the questions here again. So this is, Akiko, largely to you, does the Japan NAP cover for Japanese subsidiary or joint ventures in other countries? And I think there's another one on, for you. No, not for a moment. But Akiko, if you could answer on that one.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. So actually, our NAP, they're focusing on Japanese companies operating in Japan. So in this regard, our NAP doesn't cover any subsidiaries or joint ventures outside of Japan. But of course, the NAP that should be compliant with UNGP, and UNGP said that the company that should look at their supply chain or value chain, which doesn't matter whether it is located in Japan or the other countries. So I would say that the Japanese companies, they should do their human rights due diligence over their supply chain, even outside Japan, of course. And also our NAP, there are mentions about international cooperation and also international finance as well. So the International Cooperate Agency, the JICA, and also the JBIC, International Finance Agency, they have their safeguard as well. And that's the safeguard that should be complying with the NAP and the UNGP as well. So which that covers a bit about the Japanese companies and also joint ventured with they're based in the local their countries. I think that the point is also quite relevant to the South Asia as well.
If I can also just move on quickly to you, and there's a question, and I know you're not representing businesses in business in India, but from your experience, what do you think has been the response from the corporate bodies such as CII and FICCI on NAP in India? Has there been any engagement with such corporate groups for preparation of NAP?
Like in terms of representation from CII and FICCI, already there has been a group that was working on NAP development process along with ministry, and that had representation from industrial bodies. Also, NHRC has created this working group on business and human rights, which has representation from industrial bodies. And in Indian case, because though NAP zero draft came in 2018, what we already had in India was national guidelines on social, economic, and environmental responsibilities of businesses, which came out in 2011 and which was well deliberated among businesses, civil society, and other groups. So to that extent, I would say there has been discussion happening, and some of these industrial bodies were, representative bodies were involved in the process of development of NAP or deliberations around NAP. So yeah, to that extent, we see that participation is happening.
Sure, thanks, Dheeraj. Kanishka, there's a question for you. You mentioned that there is a draft national action plan on business and human rights in Sri Lanka. Can you please provide more details on this in terms of who's leading the process? Were there any consultations undertaken, or are there any consultations underway right now? And I think maybe also provide clarification if it's a national action plan on human rights, or is it a national action plan on business and human rights? The floor is yours, Kanishka.
It's a national action plan on human rights, and it was shared some years ago, actually about 3 years ago. and it had components in relation to the world of work as well, and certainly it relates to, and it related to certain aspects of business. But unfortunately, the consultation process has not been consistent, and as I said, the other issues that were mentioned in that draft have already been implemented, like the introduction of a special portion in relation to human rights in the Constitution, the independence commissions, and the implementation of the draft, the legislation that I mentioned is to improve civil and political rights, as well as the in legislation in relation to the right to information. In addition to that, there were other initiatives. I believe it was related to the National Action Plan, but led by the Bribery Commission. There were efforts to also draft legislation to eliminate bribery and corruption in the private sector. And we fully support that. And the objective was to achieve levels like what Hong Kong had achieved some ago. But again, that was sort of introduced, but sadly it's not, it has not been implemented. So there are gaps in relation to the National Action Plan on Human Rights, as well as some of the plans that the matters that were drafted and introduced. Implementation, I mean, action as well as implement some of these policies has been a problem. There needs to be consistency. I think that's why I said, as for Sri Lanka, I think we should also follow, even if it's in relation to business and human rights, we should follow good country examples and take that and reach out to the United Nations and other organizations like the ILO in relation to the. We also, as Gautam mentioned, reach out to countries developed our region, and I think that's the way to go ahead. So we were called for consultation years ago. The secretary who was in charge was at that time was the ministry itself was headed by the minister. That's from in the government. I do sort of distinguish between government because the state that has to continue. So, but I think there are opportunities for us to improve our methods. As you mentioned, we should also carry out baseline studies and do whatever is necessary to get there. So, as far as this is concerned, we will fully support those initiatives. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Kanishka, for that clarification. I'm going to merge kind of two questions, I think, and Gautam, this I'm going to pose to you. There are questions about the role of country leadership when it comes to developing the National Action Plan and bringing in different ministries and different departments together, but then also having a concrete action, having a concrete action matrix, and how do you, and also a monitoring and implementation framework. I mean, Sweden, if you could share your experience from what happened in Sweden, particularly in terms of any recommendations on how do you really bring in the country leadership on board, but not just the leadership, also different ministries and departments and other stakeholders that are equally important for development as well as implementation. If you could just share your experience from Sweden as well. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I first say that I'm based in Delhi Embassy here, so I'm not working with these issues back in Stockholm. But what I've observed, at least, is that what other speakers have been saying, that the stakeholder outreach must be very wide from the outset, and I think that's the key in Sweden that we had, and that's the Swedish tradition that we do try to bring as broad based stakeholder participation as possible. So that's been key. When it comes to government engagement, I saw a question on to Akiko on Japan, at least in the case of Sweden. This has been sort of set at the highest level in the government. So even our Prime Minister, Mr. Löfven, is behind the Global Compact personally. Our Trade Minister has been involved in this. So it's a signal that comes from the highest level. I think that's extremely important that you have the top levels of government pushing it and therefore mainstreaming it, as I said, in all across both the public and private sector and civil society in our country. So it's really a collaborative effort in Sweden. it's a small country. It's easier from many points of view. It also, as you say, many of these things are not new. Even like countries have had is in place for decades before. So I think this is a way of just focusing what we already be doing in terms of sustainability and CSR. So I would say that the process, when it comes to how exactly it is being followed up, I'm not the person to comment on that. I have to get back to you because I don't work with issues day to day in Stockholm. So that's more for my colleagues in Cork and in Stockholm to explain. Can I just add a quick note here that how it comes down to the field, just to give you an example. So Sweden has a feminist foreign policy, one of the first, I think the first country that developed a feminist foreign policy. And we always see gender equality as a major part of any human rights work. And so, for example, in our practical work in the embassy, we work very closely with our companies, and together with the Chamber of Commerce and our trade wing, we constantly try to push our company community by benchmarking themselves. How are they doing on gender? What is the representation of women in companies, etc. Same on sustainability. We're bringing up mappings of how Swedish companies in India are doing in sustainability, how they're sort of applying, and then we can use that as a benchmark. So I'm just saying that basically when the signal from the top in a country like Sweden, it very quickly trickles out to companies and embassies and to all the actors in Sweden and globally. So I would say we have very good experience of that, but they are not obviously always travel to other different types of government, etc. But our has been fairly good. Thank you.
Thanks, Gautam. We've just got about 15 minutes left, and I'm gonna bring two more questions. I think those are very critical questions also, specifically for you, Zoha. I think these are questions that are being posed to you. But essentially, there's a concern being raised by one of the participants that it's not been a fully and completely inclusive process. And, there have been organizations, and I'll read the question out for you. But it's an observation, for instance, that Oxfam in Pakistan initiated developing a national action plan in 2017 and engaged with wider audiences and had functioning Committee of Human Rights Senate of Pakistan endorsement. However, CSOs are not fully on board at the moment of UNDP engagement on NAP. I think it should be collective and take other INGOs on board to set the best practices. I mean, I think, and Zoha, maybe you can respond because you've been a part of the consultation processes that have been done across the country. But I think, there's also an opportunity for all of you who have concerns about the NAP development process, or the NAP development process not being very inclusive and consultative, because now the government has put it out for your comments and inputs. And I see that's a great opportunity for all of you and people who have concerns about the development process, but then also an opportunity to engage with the process. Definitely this is a public consultation that's happening online. So if you could also provide response directly to the ministry who has put up this consultation online, I think would be a good opportunity to also re-engage if there has been any disengagement in the past. But Zoha, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Harpreet. Of course, I agree that NAP has dated online means that everyone is welcome to comment on it. Secondly, while we were conducting our initial consultation, we tried to make it as inclusive as possible. But again, I would like to re-emphasize on how the consultative process has not stopped yet, has just begun. So the government has just started with, we've recommended to the government that they need to conduct more consultations on national action. It is up on a dedicated website on business and human rights in Pakistan, which presents a lot of information for all relevant and look at and then to comment on the NAP as well. Moreover, we have also recommended to the government that they need to take it to the government, and this should be a document that is endorsed by the cabinet, endorsed by the state, and is not just a document that is limited to the Ministry of Human Rights, and that is in the pipeline as well. So of course, the observation that all entities should be included within the consultation process is welcome. It is something that the ministry is working towards as well, as far as I know. And considering it is up for comment, it is the best way of engaging with the government right now is to comment on it, is to make your recommendations, and to ensure that your own opinions are reflected within the comments as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Zoha. And I see there are lots of questions still that we haven't responded to yet, but I'm sure these are some of the questions that you can also ask in different across different sessions that are happening. There are a lot of questions on Pakistan's, on Pakistan, and we do have I think we do have the Pakistan country session in about an hour or in about half an hour starting. So please do join that one. And I think there will also be opportunities for you to ask questions about Pakistan's NAP in particular in that country session as well. Given that we've got just about 10 minutes left, may I invite all the panelists to give their concluding remarks. And Akiko, if you could start with you, and if you could keep in about 2 minutes, that'd be great. Thanks. The floor is yours, Akiko.
Thank you, Harpreet, and also thank you for the wonderful discussion. I've also learned a lot, and I would like to bring it back to my country and my colleagues. So I like to emphasize the role of gap analysis once again. So I should mention that one of the weakest of our NAP is the lacking the gap analysis. So although that we have the baseline, the research, but there was no gap analysis, so that was significantly, the impacted our quality of our NAP. So I think the countries like the Pakistan or India are already quite keen to do the effective and also meaningful the gap analysis. But I would like to once again to emphasize how important it is to have the very useful NAP. And also the role of consultation, I think they already mentioned a lot, but I think that this is also quite important. And I should say that in this regard, the activities of the CSOs are significant and also fabulous. So as you see, the CSOs are coming together and also to push the government forward. And also at the first anniversary event, the Thai CSOs organize it, and also that clarifies and identified what there should be done for the implementing the NAP more effectively. So I think that in this regard, the CSOs should use this opportunity to raise their voices and also amplify their voices by collaborating each other. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Akiko. And now if you could move on to Zoha, please. Zoha, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much. This has been an interesting panel for me. I've learned a lot from all the other esteemed panelists as well. But for my concluding remarks, I would again emphasize that all national policies, all national action plans that are at the initial stages of being made, are being made and have been published, need to ensure that a structured format is followed while their creation as well. We need to focus on how the UNGPs and their implementation can be ensured. We need to focus on how government policy needs to be state-owned, but it needs to be public as well. It needs to be derived from public opinion. It needs to ensure transparency and accountability. And of course, that goes without saying, there are flaws that exist within the process right now as well, but it should be an ever-evolving process where the government understands from its mistakes, is not afraid of criticism, understands that national action plans and standard setting documents will affect the larger population and larger opinions are going to come up as well, and should continuously ensure and try to inculcate these opinions within the action points that it is creating as well. It should further engage with companies. It should try and ensure that the COVID-19 crisis, which has been a very novel crisis that we were not ready for, is something that is now reflected in future government policies, so that in the future, if something like this does happen, which has socioeconomic impacts, it can be avoided, or at least it can be managed well. And finally, I believe that this is, again, an opportunity for all countries to reevaluate their policies, to look at what is needed, and in light of the SDGs, in light of the UNGPs, and sort of update and monitor what they have been doing and where they can go on from now on. So all countries should be at a stage where they do realize that there is time for learning, there is time for improvement, and that can be done in the future as well. Thank you so much.
Sorry, did you speak to me, Harpreet? I think you were on mute. Sorry.
Sorry, yeah. If you could give your
Yeah.
concluding remarks, please.
Yeah, I think we are, if I'm to focus on Sri Lanka, I think we have a lot to learn and take on board. But what is important for us to mention is that we have a very strong base where business and compliance is concerned, particularly in relation to the world of work. We have very high rates of compliance in relation to co-conventions. We also have high compliance in relation to other international standards because we are an exporting nation. And we also have very high values in relation to issues on things like migration, because Zoha mentioned about the COVID-19 situation, and we were one of the first countries to allow migration of people, and also allowed vessels to come in spite of other countries turning them out because of the health concerns, of course. But we started facilitating people going from one place to the other for work, and we also took in critically ill people. So I think that's a good way to look at things, and I think the COVID-19 has also taught us to be more agile and implement certain things in relation to our business agenda to enhance human rights and things like that. So we have a very strong base in Sri Lanka. We are a democratic country. We have been one of the longest democratic countries in this region consistently. So I think we can build. There are a lot of opportunities that we can build on, and certainly business can support governments in relation to developing national action plans on business and human rights, as well as support them in relation to their own action plans with regard to implementing of and promoting human rights as well as SDGs. So we have been supporting government, and we will continue to do so, but we also have a lot to learn from countries like in our own region, India and Pakistan. Of course, there are a lot, Akiko mentioned about Japan, Gautam mentioned about certain other countries in the world. So I think there are a lot of things that we can learn. Thank you. But there's a huge capacity issue that we need to address as well. I think it should be addressed in a way that we also learned during the COVID how important it is to create ecosystems so that we can reach out not only to the larger companies but to the smaller businesses as well, because standards have to be developed in unison and with a lot of cohesion. Thank you.
Thanks, Kanishka. Dheeraj, if I can move on to you. Your concluding remarks, please. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Harpreet. So looking at the situation in India, I think we are at a stage where soon we would be having the first draft before us, and it provides us good ground to start conversations on business on human rights as a theme. And I would agree with, as other panelists also said, that it's a starting point in terms of building on this conversation on business and human rights. And I see that not to be very pessimistic, but I see, based on our own analysis and research over the last decade or so, what we are also seeing that human rights as a concept or as a word is also in conversations getting diluted as we are moving into these conversations. So it's also an opportunity for us to reclaim human rights as a principle and approach, I will say, in our work. At the same time, it provides businesses with an opportunity to be vocal and to take stand on certain principles when it comes to government, citizen, and business interface, I would say. So it's an opportunity for all stakeholders at the same time, and all of us need to play our role in that space. So I look forward to these conversations further, and hope as we move into March, move into April or May, we will have first draft in place and we will have more such discussions.
Hopefully, Dheeraj. Thank you for that. Gautam, if I can move on to you for your concluding remarks, please.
Thank you, Harpreet. And it's been fascinating, as I said, really interesting to hear from all of you, and encouraging to see the developments in various countries in Asia. So it's definitely spreading in Asia. As I said, Sweden has been part of this from the beginning. We are committed to the process. Our development cooperation regional office in Bangkok is supporting and collaborating with UNDP. We would like to be part of the process as it goes on. I think that we have great scope in the countries which I cover from Delhi, is Sri Lanka and India, for example, to work closer with the Indians and Sri Lankan stakeholders, and to involve our Swedish MNCs present in your countries in a better way, also to reach out to the MSMEs in a meaningful way. So I think we have lots to do there. I think in our dialogues with the Indian and Sri Lankan governments, speaking on my behalf, I think we would like to involve and include this topic of business and human rights much more, but we need your help also in that. So we would like to reach out to you, Dheeraj, and to Kanishka, for example, and have further conversations on how we can work better and incorporate this topic in our bilateral contact. So we look forward to working with you all, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Gautam. And we have come to the end of the session. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I know it was one of the sessions where we've had lots of questions coming in, and I wish we had the time to respond to all the questions. But I see there are a lot of questions to Pakistan. So please join our country session on Pakistan, which starts in about half an hour. And perhaps you can also ask these questions again, because there would be the government of Pakistan and other authorities present in that session. And perhaps you can ask these questions there. But thank you very much. And also I would like to take this opportunity to thank the government of Sweden, also because they've been supporting this huge project on business and human rights with the UNDP, but also have supported us in organization of the South Asia Forum as well. So thanks, Gautam, and to your colleagues, but then also the government of Sweden. Thank you, everyone. And we look forward to continue these conversations offline as well. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone.